Welcome to another episode of Business Over Bourbon, where we pour equal parts business knowledge and fine bourbon to make a truly memorable cocktail. Your bartender for the evening is Corey Perlman, who's a digital marketing speaker and consultant by day, and Jimmy Buffett impersonator by night. That last part's a lie, but a man can dream. And now, put your pencil in one hand and highball glass in the other. It's time for Business Over Bourbon.
What's up, everybody? It's Corey Perlman coming back on another Business Over Bourbon episode. Once again, completely and utterly excited about today's guest. He kind of goes way back. He probably doesn't know this, but one of the first blogs, kind of like, you know, as you're growing up in the business, the blog that kind of helped me set on my path of digital marketing and marketing was this guy's blog, Social Media Explorer. So I've known him for a long time. I've been a fan for a long time. And then a mutual friend of ours got us together, and in a love of bourbon, here we are. So Jason Falls, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me, Corey. It's good to be here, man.
Yeah. So let me tell you all, well, first of all, again, just so everybody knows, we're going to talk some business, and you're going to love a lot of the things that Jason has to talk about from a digital marketing perspective, but we're also going to sip bourbon. And the interesting thing that I learned about Jason is that he lives in Louisville, Kentucky, the home of bourbon. How do you like living in literally the birthplace of bourbon?
You know, it's pretty awesome, and especially in the last 4 or 5 years, because the bourbon industry has really been booming. There's a lot of renovation and construction going on in downtown Louisville to take the bourbon trail experience, where you can go out to the distilleries and do an urban bourbon trail experience, where they've got, you know, downtown facilities. Angel's Envy just opened in downtown Louisville. The Evan Williams experience has been open for a couple of years. I think there's like 5 or 6 more planned to open in the next couple of years, including a huge installation for Old Forester. So it's a fantastic place to be if you love bourbon, but it's definitely a place where if you live here, you have to learn to exercise some good judgment from time to time, or you can overdo it a little bit.
Kind of like being a gambling fan and living in Vegas, right?
Exactly. It's exactly the same thing. You gotta watch it.
Gotcha. Well, awesome, man. And we'll get into this, but when we picked this bourbon, and to come to find out that you actually worked on a project with this particular company is also super cool. So let me just tell folks a little bit more about Jason, and I've got his bio here, but I can almost speak off of this, candidly. He's a major keynoter and consultant in our industry. When you do the circuit like I have in terms of the social media world, his name is at the top of the list from digital marketing experts and digital leaders. It really is. So again, I'm really honored to have you on as a guest. Jason, you basically do consulting projects for a lot of clients. Do me a favor. I know one of them is the one that we're about to announce, but what are a few of the clients that you've worked with over the last few years, notable clients?
Wow. I mean, if you go back to the early days in social media for me, you're talking about my first main social media project was with Maker's Mark Bourbon, which I'm sure you've either talked about or will talk about more specifically on the show. I've done a lot of work in the spirits industry. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Most recently, the spirit that I most recently worked with was Fireball Whiskey, which is an interesting brand, a challenger brand, and kind of a shooter brand. So that's a little bit different. But I've also worked on the opposite end of the spectrum. I've worked with healthcare clients like Humana. I've worked with a couple of banks and financial institutions. I did a project for Trident chewing gum once upon a time. So I've kind of bounced around to a bunch of different brands, done some technology startups and whatnot over the years. And actually, one of the clients I'm working with right now is a healthcare client that provides occupational and speech and physical therapists to nursing homes. So right. I've done a little bit of everything.
Yeah. And, the one thing, when people ask in our industry, kind of what differentiates you, I'm going to speak for you, at least an aspect of you is that, and I just saw the show Hamilton, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, phenomenal show. And one of the lines, and I'll butcher it a little bit here, but, he says, he's talking to his counterpart in the show, and he says, if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for everything. And one of the things that I know about you is you take stands and positions on things in the space. You don't you don't sit middle of the road, do you, Jason? You will go one way or the other. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. And the lesson that I learned along the way that sort of pushed me in that direction early on in the evolution of Social Media Explorer, it was only a month old, and I went to a social media conference back then, and I wasn't speaking at conferences then. I was just trying to learn my way around. And I went to this conference in New York City, and they spent 3 days talking about how to game Dig and get on the front page of Dig. This was 2006, 2007. And I just thought that was really disingenuous to what social media was all about. So I wrote a blog post about my experience, and I said, all these leaders in the social media and SEO world are talking about how to game the system. They're talking about how to cheat is what they're doing. And oh man, I pissed a lot of people off.
Yes, you did.
And they all came to my blog and attacked me and defended themselves. But what I realized was, if you take a stand and if you stir things up, whether you're right or wrong, whether you have to apologize later or not, doesn't really matter. People pay attention to you. And so I went from being a nobody to that asshole overnight. And then from that point, I went from being that asshole to, that guy's constantly saying things that might actually make sense. So I mean, it was a path.
You wrote a book called No Bullshit Social Media. I remember looking at that line, and you know what my first thought was? I was like, fuck, man, he took my title. It was awesome, man. You were the one who hit it first. And I've just appreciated it. And I'll give a shout out to our mutual friend, Eric Brown, that he's always been like that too. And I think he probably learned that philosophy from you. And I completely agree. And the authentic nature, in our industry back in 2006, 7, 8, and in the kind of the olden days, the pioneering days of SEO and internet marketing, there were a lot of people who were trying to do it wrong. And, you kind of stood the ground and said, there is a way to do this sort of white hat or right. And I appreciate that, because I agree 100% on that.
Thanks.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bourbon for a second here. So I want to officially announce to our listeners. So we got people listening on podcasts. We also got people watching on YouTube. So we're going to do the reveal that we always do on this show. And when I asked you the bourbon you wanted to pick, I was very excited and pleasantly surprised. Not really surprised, but just excited that you picked Basil Hayden, one of my favorites. There it is, Basil Hayden. So for those of you listening right now, we are both holding up a bottle of Basil Hayden, which is a phenomenal bourbon in itself. Now, one of my tips, Jason, for good bourbons is to follow the bees. I've always told people that when they're in a bar and they're looking up, you know what I'm talking about, and you're looking up at the bar, you're not sure what to get, follow the bees. Basil Hayden is one. Blanton's is one of my all-time favorites. Booker's is great. Bullet, and there's probably others, but you fall into that B category and you're pretty safe. And most of those, if I'm not mistaken, are from Kentucky. Is that right?
Yes, all the ones you mentioned are, and 95% of the world's bourbon does come from Kentucky. And there's a reason for that. I don't know if you've covered that on the show yet, but the reason that 95% of the world's bourbon comes from Kentucky is the water for most of these bourbon distilleries comes from the Kentucky River, and the Kentucky River is a natural limestone bed spring, and the limestone actually changes the pH of the water. And the different pH of the water from that type of riverbed going into the distillation process and the barreling process helps the bourbon and the spirit age differently, and it helps the flavor palette mature into what it becomes. You could take water from any other river and do the same process, and it's going to taste different, and it's not going to taste as good. It's going to be a little hot, it's going to be a little rough, but that limestone bed spring pH is what makes it really flavorful and smooth. And that's kind of the secret. Now, you can make bourbon anywhere in the United States. And there's good bourbons from other places in the United States, but Kentucky kind of has a little bit of a home field advantage there.
Is it fair to say that, that if you, will you drink a bourbon outside of Kentucky, generally speaking, or do you just?
Oh yeah. I'm a fan of bourbon, and I'm a fan of whiskey in general. I mean, there's lots of scotches, lots of Irish whiskeys I really like. I remember when I saw Hudson Bay bourbon come out, when it first came out years ago, I was like, people in New York can't make bourbon. What the hell? And I tried it and I was like, this isn't bad.
Yeah.
And so I've tried, some from Indiana. There's actually a distillery in I think Lawrenceburg, Indiana, which is not too far north of here, that doesn't use limestone bed spring water, but it kind of churns out bourbon. It's one of those places where you can go and say, I'm an entrepreneur. I've got a wad of cash. I want you to make a bourbon with this mash bill, this mixture, and then I'm going to put my own label on it and sell it. And that's where a lot of these like craft bourbons are coming from, is people just trying to, try a new recipe. But there's a distillery up there that churns out a bunch of different ones, and they've turned out some pretty good ones. I've had several in the last couple of years that I've been really that I liked a lot.
And you can mix the other 49%, right? So 51% corn, and then the 49% is kind of up to you. Is that?
Yeah, it's generally some combination of rye and barley, or wheat, red winter wheat, some sort of sweetened instead of rye, kind of a sweeter grain, and malted barley. And so the red winter wheats is like Maker's Mark, is going to be sweeter, softer on the palate. The more rye bourbons like Basil Hayden, which we're getting ready to try, has a little bit more of what I call a sour flavor. And sour is not good or bad. It's just a descriptor. Some people like sour. Some people like sweet in a bourbon profile. And so it's 51% corn, and the rest can be some combination of the others. When you're talking about commercially successful big bourbon brands, you're looking in the mid 70s in terms of corn. They're going to be 75, 76% corn, something like that, and then some variation of the other two.
Okay. Well, let's officially toast and have our first sip to Cheers. Basil Hayden. Thanks again for being on the show, Jason.
Oh, glad to be here.
I see you drinking yours neat or on the rocks. You like rocks, or?
I put a couple of cubes in there because I poured it a few minutes ago and I didn't want it to be hot. So
yeah, and I've got my my guitar ice cube here that's in here. So let me just tell the folks a little bit about, and again, I would love to hear your perspective. It'll be a great transition to what we talk about here, but about Basil Hayden. It looks like it's 80 proof. Does that sound right for Basil Hayden? It seems low.
Yeah, it's 80 proof, and that's one of the criticisms that a lot of people have had of it early on. When it first came out as part of the Jim Beam small batch collection, it got some gruff from the sort of chiseled bourbon veterans because it was too soft. It also came in a pretty. I mean, if you look at the package, it's got this cool little bracelet thing that you can actually take off and wear. I think you used to be able to, and it's kind of a sort of a metro design. It's a little sort of artistically done, and so it got a little bit of criticism from the old school whiskey folks for being too light, too not enough rye, not enough proof, and also looking a little too hippie, a little too yuppie, and it wasn't ever really billed as your granddad's bourbon. It was billed as a new take on bourbon. And for a while there in the early to mid 2000s, as the small batch started to kind of emerge, it really became popular in kind of the urban nightclub scene, sort of the metrosexual scene. It became it was very popular with the gay community. And I say that from research, not as just an assumption. I saw research that said that. And it was because it was kind of hip. It was trendy. It was a good cocktail mixing bourbon, but it was also rye, so it had some body to it. And so after they took the age statement off of it in the last couple of years, I think, it's actually started to gain in popularity. Beam's done a good job of positioning it in the last few years.
What did it take off of the?
It used to be 8 years, I believe, was Basil Hayden. I know Booker's was, I want to say 9, and Baker's was 7, and Basil Hayden was 8, I believe. I'm doing that from memory.
Okay.
And so it used to be aged 8 years. Now they just say artfully aged, and they don't have an age statement on it.
Gotcha. The one thing also that I know I've always noticed about Basil Hayden is, like you said, the label and the bottle. Like when you look up there, and I know a couple of times I've been showing friends sort of the variety of bourbons, and Basil Hayden tends to be the one that stands out to them. So I think whomever designed the packaging on it, did a really good job. And it is it's different, it stands out amongst the rest,
It does. And to be honest with you, I mean, if I were the brand manager there, and I've known a couple of their brand managers over the years, but if I were the brand manager there, I would take that, this little bracelet thing on it, which used to be, I think you can still take it off and actually turn it into a bracelet or wear it.
Yeah.
But you could take that and turn it into a line of jewelry. Yeah. I mean, it's actually a classy looking little thing.
That's
nice
awesome.
Little brand.
Good call. Well, 10% goes to 5% goes to the show, 5% goes to you if they start merchandising Basil Hayden.
I wish.
Tell us if you don't mind a little bit about your work with them, and kind of just the history with maybe a little bit into Basil Hayden, and then what you did from a marketing perspective for some of the other spirits.
Sure. So I had the opportunity to work with the Beam brands in the mid to late 2000s. So 2008, 2009, around in there. I had started out working with Maker's Mark, which is also owned by the Beam Company, but managed by the Samuels family. So it's kind of separated out from the small batch, a little different. But the U.S. director of whiskeys at the time was a young lady by the name of Sam Seiler, who incidentally since then has had a big role in forming Angel's Envy and getting that to market, which is not a Beam brand. It's an independent brand. But Sam brought me to the table to do some projects for Jim Beam, which I did and worked on and had some fun there. But she also asked me to sort of lend a consulting ear, as it were, to the small batch collection, because they were trying to figure out, they had already broken out Knob Creek and made it its own sort of standalone brand. And they were considering doing the same thing with Basil Hayden. And again, this is, 10 years ago. So it's been quite a while. And so I was just trying to advise them on social media, how they were going to redesign their websites and whatnot at the time. And I actually came up with a concept that I pitched to them, and they didn't take it. I wish they had, because I think it would have been a really cool idea. But I pitched them the concept of basically doing a lifestyle website, kind of like an uncrate.com, that was really focused on that sort of, young male hipster, looking for cocktails, looking for nightlife ideas, looking for maybe even business and professional ideas to be, young and savvy and cool, and make BasilHayden.com go to that place that had Basil Hayden and had cocktail recipes, was but really about the target audience. And I pitched that concept to them, and I think, everybody liked the idea, but I don't think they were quite ready to say, well, it has to be 100% about the bourbon or it doesn't make sense.
Right.
And I think if I'd pitched it, in the last couple of years, they probably would have responded very differently. And even their website now, even though it's still really focused on the bourbon, it definitely has that kind of flavor of a lifestyle brand. And so I just I overshot my bounds back then, but I didn't work directly on Basil Hayden, very much, but I did advise the brands, the small batch brands, a little bit, and had a good time working with them and getting to know the Beam family and the Beam family of brands quite well back then, and had a nice little run with them. It was fun.
Yeah, it's funny. We mentioned Eric again, and he can drink a shot every time I mention his name. This is the second time, but he took that exact philosophy on his apartment complex as the lifestyle brand, and really made. I remember Urbane Apartments in Michigan, and this guy was 97% lease, folks, during a very down economic time in Detroit. And the way he did it was purely digital. And a big part of it was making it a lifestyle. Like when you went to this rental apartment community, it talked about everything but rental apartments. It was insane. And it was one of the highest trafficked blog in the area. And he got business from it, but it was completely indirectly. So you were obviously a little before your time, but you were onto something there, man.
Yeah, and Eric and I came along, really about the same time. I was, working on advising brands, and he was running an apartment, business. So we're very like-minded guys. He actually wrote for me for Social Media Explorer for a few years as well. So Eric and I go way back, and he was doing it right back then too.
Yeah. So one of the timely things that I want to talk to you a little bit about is, and again, this kind of piggybacks on what I talked about earlier about standing for something, but one of the blog articles that stood out to me was one that you wrote on about personal branding versus business branding. And you read a Facebook post that was kind of saying that without your personal brand, you are nothing. And you were like, well, same with, I don't know, you said yoga pants or something. Was I saying that wrong?
So the post was from a guy named Carlos Skills, real smart guy. And he's real big on personal branding. And there's nothing wrong with being big on personal branding. It is important in a lot of ways. But he said, personal branding, is what helps you, set you aside from the crowd so that you're not like Where's Waldo or something like that. I don't remember what it was. And I responded, he said, basically he was saying, you need a personal brand because it helps you stand out. And I said, well, so do neon yoga pants. It's not the only, but that's not the only thing you need.
Right.
And my point was, if I put on neon yoga pants, I stand out, but it doesn't mean I can do the job. It doesn't mean I'm good at what I say I'm good at. Personal brands are fantastic, especially for people in the marketing world, because if you have a really active personal brand, and by that I mean you've got a blog and you represent yourself well on social networks and you're constantly doing things to get out in front of your industry and speak at conferences and be a personality as opposed to just someone who's in the industry and stand out from the crowd. If you do that in the marketing world, that speaks to your talent and your skill. I know how to get attention for something. Right now it's myself, but you could hire me to do that for you. So in the marketing world, it works. But my point is, if you are an accountant or if you are an analyst for a venture capital firm or, for that matter, if you're a freaking insurance salesman, a personal brand only shows that you know how to get attention on you. It doesn't necessarily translate to the job that you're applying for or what you're trying to do. So if I am an accountant and I'm really good at auditing and I'm really good at tax returns and whatnot, all I need to do to get that job is prove to those people that I can audit and I can do tax returns and I can count money. I don't need to prove to them that I can blog and that I can have a fantastic Instagram following. Now, if you do and you're able to establish some thought leadership in your industry and whatnot, that's fine. It's a nice to have, but it's not a must have. And I was just pushing back a little bit against the personal branding advocates out there that are like, the most important thing you could ever have is a personal brand, because that's true in maybe a handful of industries, but it's not true in most of them. And my challenge to the crowd when I was saying that was, find someone who is a very successful financier or venture capitalist or insurance adjuster or corporate real estate, person or litigating attorney, and show me one that has a really strong personal brand in terms of the online BS that we say personal branding is. Very few, if any, are going to have it because they're busy getting the work done. Right. They're really good at what they do, and that's what you need to be able to communicate. Personal brands can help, but they're not a must-have kind of thing.
It seems like a little bit like it's the exception, not the rule. Like you said, I mean, you probably could find some in each industry that are doing it, but for every few that you find, there's hundreds or thousands others that are kind of got their head buried, if you will, just doing the work and getting the business done.
Yeah, and I'll give you another example that I used in the discussion, which turned into a much more of a discussion that I had really cared to participate in, but it's the way the internet works. So Insider Louisville is a hyper-local news source, kind of an online newspaper here in Louisville. And full disclosure, they're a client of mine, but that is irrelevant to the story. So Insider Louisville published the top 100 influencers in advertising and marketing in Louisville about 2 or 3 months ago. And if you were to go by personal brands alone, there's reason to believe that I would be in the top few on that list. I don't concentrate my business or what I do in Louisville, but I have a lot of Twitter followers and yada, yada, yada. I've got the blog and all the personal brand crap. So you would think I'm going to be 1, 2, or 3. I was in the top 10 on that list, but I was 7th. The number 1 person was Lisa Siebert, who is active online, has a really good, strong personal brand online, happens to also be the CEO of an agency here in town, an ad agency. Makes perfect sense for her to be number 1. The number 2 person on that list was my old boss, the CEO at Doe Anderson, a guy named Todd Spencer. And Todd has no personal brand. He has a personal Facebook account. He has a personal Twitter account, doesn't use it very often. He doesn't necessarily blog. He doesn't necessarily speak at conferences and have online videos and all the Carlos Gill prescribed personal brand things. And I don't mean to pick on Carlos, because Carlos is a smart guy and is given good advice, very enthusiastic about it. But that shows me and the Insider Louisville does, they factor in like how long you've been at your company. Are you executive level? Do you serve on boards? Are you active in the nonprofit community? How much real influence do you have? Not just online followers. And to see that they took into account the entire sphere of influence and brand, and ranked it, and someone who doesn't have a big personal brand came in number 2 on that list, that's just kind of proof positive that shows you when you look at the big picture, personal brand has something to do with it. Sure. It can help you move up the list. Sure. But influence comes from lots of places, not just how many people follow you on Twitter.
So let's put this in the practical terms for a second for the folks out there. So we got an accounting firm, 15 to 20 accountants, and they're developing a marketing digital strategy. As they are, figuring out time to resources and things of that nature, what would you say from a strategy perspective they should focus on the business or corporate brand versus the personal brand? How would you help them make that differentiator between the two?
For an accounting firm, I would spend almost all of my resources on the business brand, not asking my accountants to go build personal brands. And there's one primary reason for that. If I am a company hiring an accounting firm to do my accounting, I want to know that they can do the accounting. I don't give a damn that they can sell themselves. I really don't care. And I also don't want to hire someone to come and do my accounting who is going to overshadow my company. I wouldn't go out, no offense to Gary Vee, but I wouldn't go hire Gary Vee to do my marketing because Gary Vee is always going to be bigger than me. Mm-hmm. And that's not what I want. I want someone who's going to make me the big thing, right? As a company. So I'm going to tell them to focus on the company brand. And then I'm also going to say, if it behooves you in your industry, or maybe even in your local community, to have a face and voice, kind of a person who represents you, have that one person, somebody who's good in front of a crowd, somebody who's good on webinars and on camera and whatnot. Have that one person work on their personal brand, but keep that balance between the company and them. Mm-hmm. Keep a cushion there, because you don't want this.
Right.
You don't want that person, because if it's not an owner of the company and that person gets to hear, then they're going to disappear and go start their own thing. And now you're going to be way down here. Right. So keep that balance and make sure you're protecting the company asset. It's
kind of, they could be like a spokesperson for the brand as opposed to themselves.
And there's plenty of examples like that out there. And there's plenty of examples of companies that have gone out and hired someone with a strong personal brand to be representative of them, who's done a fantastic job. I mean, somebody like, Dave Peck just left PayPal for another opportunity, and he doesn't outshine the PayPal brand, but he is a noted person within certain industry circles that made sense for them to go get him. He was a good representative of that company and could be out there in front of the public, was a trusted, known entity before he got there, and brought a lot of credibility to that brand.
All right, we're going to, we're going to dive into another topic, but right on the same page as that. But I want to talk about the bourbon again for the second.
Okay.
And Basil Hayden. So, and not to put you on the spot too much since you did have a relationship with them, but do you like Basil Hayden? If you do like Basil Hayden, why do you like Basil Hayden besides licking the bottle?
Yeah. I do like Basil Hayden. It is not in what I would call my category of favorites because I'm a sweet bourbon guy, and Basil Hayden has an inordinately high rye profile. So it is what I would call a sour bourbon. Again, that's not a judgment. It's just how I describe the taste. It's going to be a little bit more harsh. It's not going to be as sugary, caramel sweet. It's going to have a little bit more spice tone to it. When I smell and drink Basil Hayden, I'm smelling things like cinnamon, maybe if I'm stretching and believe me, I don't get too froofy on this stuff. I don't sit there and go, "Oh, that's roasted pear and nutmeg." Whatever. It's freaking bourbon, for God's sakes. Don't be stupid. But I do get some spiciness, some spicy flavor rather than sweet, sugary, or fruity flavors out of it. And when I drink it, it's for a high rye bourbon, it's really smooth. So it's got a nice, even profile. It's not going to necessarily burn a particular part of your tongue too much. The finish has a little bit of a rim finish, which gives you a hint of sweet, but mostly a sour finish. I like it. This is one of those cold night bourbons. Like the higher rye content bourbons are good ones for the wintertime when you got a fire going and you want something that'll give you a little bit of a burn, kind of a burn right here to kind of warm you up. Basil's good for that. But Why I like basil and why I like to keep some on hand from time to time is that it is a really good cocktail mixing bourbon. If you want to make a good cocktail for someone who's not a bourbon drinker, but wants to really get a bourbon flavor, something that's rich and deep and got some
like
rye
a
to
Southern
it.
Mule, maybe, or a Manhattan, or an Old Fashioned, or something like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Basil's a really good, because it's so smooth. It's a really good mixing bourbon, but it does have that high rye content, so it still tastes like bourbon. It doesn't lose itself in the cocktail.
And it's not overly expensive. So even if you're mixing it, I mean, I think on average the price is around $40 to $45. That about right for that bourbon?
I think I bought this bottle last night, and I want to say I paid $38 for it.
So a little bit depends on your,
it just depends on where you are. In Kentucky, I can probably get a good deal on stuff from time to time.
Right. Now, just a random Kentucky question. You mentioned when you and I were just starting out, the bourbon tours and such. Any recommendations, first of all, on the different distilleries to visit? And if they do, a couple of reminders to people if they come to Kentucky and visit the distilleries?
Yeah, pace yourself. That's a good one right there. So I'm a little biased, but I do have a pretty good sort of even, perspective on it all. I personally don't think there's a better experience than Maker's Mark. Going to Laredo, which is 45 to 50 minutes outside of Louisville, kind of in the middle of nowhere, is an experience in and of itself. The distillery is kind of down in this, what we call hollers in Kentucky. It's kind of down in this little holler by the creek. Mm-hmm. But you get to dip your own bottle, and they've put a lot of thought and care into the process there. And Maker's Mark is really a beautiful place and a beautiful experience. One of its main competitors is also a fantastic experience, which is Woodford Reserve, which is over near Versailles, Kentucky, closer to Lexington than it is Louisville. And Woodford has a fantastic experience. They've got a great tasting room and tasting experience after it's all over. And I love what they do there. I've been to Early Times, Wild Turkey, Four Roses. Jim Beam has a newer experience in Claremont, which is about 30 miles south of Louisville. And there's Buffalo Trace has a fantastic experience, and that's where, if you're really lucky in the tasting room, you might get to taste a little bit of Pappy, which Pappy Van Winkle for me. There's different ages of Pappy.
Sure.
I think it's the 26 is the one that's just impossible to get, and expensive as hell. But there's lower age statement Pappies, and everybody in the bourbon world tends to think of Pappy as kind of the ultimate bourbon because they're aged a lot longer than most bourbons, and the longer the age is, for whatever reason, they put a higher price on it. Here's my take on that, though. I think Pappy's good. I like Pappy. I've had the very expensive one a couple of times. I had too much to drink in a bar and ordered around for my friends, which is stupid. But anyway, I've had the good Pappy a couple of times, the older one, and I like Pappy. It's very good. It's pretty daggone smooth. But I've kind of followed the Maker's Mark, Bill Samuels Jr., who taught me this years ago, philosophy on bourbon. Every bourbon has a sweet spot in aging. So depending upon the mash bill and how it's distilled and everything else, you put the barrel in the rick house, and it's going to mature to a point where it tastes optimally good. And there's going to be a window where it stays that way. And then beyond that, it's going to deteriorate and not taste optimally good. And for instance, Maker's Mark, it was between like 5.5 and 7.5 years was where it tasted like Maker's Mark. If it was too young, it just wasn't ripe. It was too hot. It wasn't smooth enough. And if it's too old, it kind of got a little dirty and a little muddled, and it didn't taste as good anymore. So that sweet spot is where the tasting panel says, yeah, pull that barrel out of the rick house, put that in a batch. We're ready to go with that one. On bourbon, unlike wine, the age statement doesn't necessarily mean the higher the better.
Interesting.
A 26-year-old bourbon is not necessarily better than a 9-year-old bourbon, depending upon the distillation process, the mash bill, how hot the summers are when you put it in the rick house, how cold the winters are. Do you move the barrel around the rick house so that it ages evenly? There's so many factors that go into it. There's really no good way to know unless you're the master distiller and you're testing this stuff over decades. And so that's one reason why I think you're starting to see a lot of bourbons like Basil Hayden remove their age statement. The other reason why is, think about this. If this was aged 8 years, right? And let's say the expectation for Basil Hayden this year is to sell 150,000 cases. The master distiller needed to know that 8 years ago to know how much to put in the rick house. Impossible.
Right.
Impossible to keep up with demand. So if you take the age statement off of it, theoretically, you can widen your sweet spot to say, well, the good part's here, but if we put it here, we'll have more to sell and it's still acceptable.
Right. And we're not lying.
Right. It's kind of cheating the old way of doing it a little bit, but it's also making more product available.
My buddy and I, just this past weekend, we were at a restaurant, and somebody had gifted them a 10-year-old Pappy. And so we had ordered Elijah Craig, but before we had put that order in, we just asked him, how much will the Pappy be? And he said $20 a pour. And we thought that, and, we really didn't know. So we said deal, because we knew it would be somewhere in that age. And so we got that. Was that a good deal? I mean, did we?
For the 10-year Pappy, $20 a pour is not unreasonable.
Okay.
Depending upon where you are. I think in Kentucky, you're probably going to be able to get it a little cheaper.
Okay.
But not a whole lot cheaper. Okay. You're also going to find some really good bourbons that are comparable at a lower price. But I think there's a 10-year Pappy, and I want to say maybe a 15, and then you get into there's a 20 and maybe a 26. I have seen the 26 as high as, I want to say, maybe $95 to $100 a pour. That's for 2 ounces.
Right.
That's a lot of money for 2 ounces of liquor.
Yep.
And I'm not saying it's not worth it or it's not good. And if you want to try it, by all means, if you have the means to do it, go do it. I've done it. I've done it sober, and I've done it with a few in me, which wasn't the smart idea. But I honestly think that you don't have to pay more than $10 to $12 a pour to get a good bourbon. And quite frankly, there's some really cheap bourbons that I think are really good.
Me too.
So there's a lot. I'm telling you, Evan Williams Black Label, keep that bottle on hand at your house. You're never going to spend more than $15, $18 for it. And it's a great mixing bourbon, and it's nice and smooth going down, neat. Evan Williams is one of those bourbons where if you don't have a lot of money to spend, it's a good bourbon.
We haven't had this one on the show yet, but I'm a big fan of Johnny Drum. I'm not sure if you've had that one yet either.
Yep. Johnny Drum's. I had dinner with a friend of mine tonight, and she said she mixes Johnny Drum with a little Diet Coke and calls it her boyfriend. So.
Nice. Well, we got Jason Falls on the show. Jason, again, thanks for being here. By the way, if you're listening to the show or watching the show, and what my interest in is if you have an expertise, it doesn't have to be social media. We've had a lot of social media experts on because that's kind of my forte as well. But we've also had, bourbon experts who are restaurant owners. We've had, sales and marketing, leadership, so we will cross the gamut on whatever expertise you have. The main rule of this show is that you're a bourbon fan and you got a bourbon that you want to talk about. So that's the key. And Jason, if you know anybody who loves bourbon almost as much as you do, we'd love to have him on the show.
I got a few names for you. We'll talk later.
All right. So we're going to move into our second topic here. And a big part of, I find this pretty fascinating. You've been talking about this for a while, and it sort of goes against the grain a little bit in social media, because everybody in social media kind of thinks that it's the megaphone in their hand, but it's social listening. And this is something you've kind of attached yourself to for many years. Tell me kind of why you see that as such an important topic, and a little bit of background as to what it is for some people may not be sure.
Sure. So social listening, which, when the software companies that were trying to capitalize on the social media wave started coming out, you probably heard the term social media monitoring. And they were basically customer service, PR crisis response approaches where, hey, we can do a constant search for your brand name. And when someone says it on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, you'll get an alert. And if it's someone complaining or bitching about your product, then you can, route that to customer service or respond or whatever. And then the software companies realized that was just the tip of the iceberg of what you could do with these tools. So they started calling themselves social listening platforms, which is a little bit more of a proactive thing, not a reactive thing. And essentially how these softwares work, and some of them, by the way, are now calling themselves social analytics, which is way broad and doesn't necessarily define anything, but they didn't never ask my opinion. Anyway, so social listening tools essentially are like, it's like a Google search. In essence, you type in a keyword or a keyword phrase, and it goes out to all the publicly available social media conversations out there on blogs, forums, comment sections, Twitters, Facebooks, Instagrams, blah, blah, blah. Anything that's publicly available. And I'll come back to that in just a second to iron that out. And it pulls it all in and says, hey, here's everybody who said something about this keyword phrase that you're searching for in the last whatever time frame you tell it to. And what this does is it sort of collects the conversation about you online or about that topic online. Now, most companies, most brands, probably upwards of 85 or 90% right now, still use that as a PR customer service function. Someone said something bad, route it to customer service or respond to it, fix the issue. Someone said something good, amplify it, retweet it, thank them, whatever. What I've always tried to do, or not always, but since about 2009 or 10, when I started really getting deep in the weeds on these platforms, is I realized, hey, we can go out and mine these conversations for information, for insights about our customers. We can learn more about what they're talking about, why they're talking about it, who they're talking about it with, in what contexts they're talking about it. Are they talking about it the way we want them to? Are they not? Why is that, et cetera? So I started looking at it as market research. I can go into these conversations and say, hey, here's 100 conversations about Basil Hayden. Well, what are people saying? Are they talking about the color, the taste, the price? Give me some feedback on what people are saying about this. So as the brand manager, if I were the brand manager, I can say, man, everybody is moaning and bitching about how they can't get the bracelet off. It's glued on the back, and God bless, I want to wear that damn thing. Well, let's make that adhesive a little lighter so they can just pull it off, right? Mm-hmm. Or put a pull tab on it. These are the types of product and feature insights that you can find sometimes in social media conversations. So last fall, after years of doing this behind the scenes for clients, and at Social Media Explorer actually published a banking industry report in 2012 where I used these techniques. But last fall, I started a company with a couple of friends of mine called the Conversation Research Institute. And that's what we do, is we mine online conversations looking for customer insights. So we can help you figure out what people are saying about you, your competition, your industry, your category. But we go well beyond just brand mentions. Like I had a client recently who said, we sell primarily to attorneys at corporations, but we want to know what they're saying about the law firms that they hire. Right. So it was a very granular, it wasn't a branded conversation. It was, what does this group of people, what does this audience say about this audience? So really granular stuff. And we were able to uncover some interesting things to pass on to the client there. So we mine online conversations for insights and have been doing it now for a little over 7 months. And, the company's growing slow, but we're getting new clients by the week, and it's a lot of fun.
Are your clients typically larger clients, or can small businesses use you guys?
They're typically larger clients. We're working on the ability to turn that type of online research around for small businesses, but it's a little bit prohibitive. It's hard to do because in order to get to those conversations, you have to use one of the sophisticated research tools, and they're pretty pricey. Okay. So you're talking thousands of dollars a month just in software fees. So we're trying to work with a couple of partners to figure out, okay, how can we take one license, divide it up amongst a bunch of small businesses, and have them pay a little bit of money to get at least some sort of automated report. The problem with automated reports from our perspective is anybody can go out there and sign up for, there's some that cost several $1,000s a month, and then there's some that are pretty daggone cheap. And there's socialmention.com, which is free. You can just go try it out. But what the automated things do is you type in your keyword and they go collect the data, and then they count things, which is one step of the market research process.
Right.
They don't analyze things.
Right.
They tag cloud and they group things by volume, but they don't say, 150 conversations use the word sucks with Basil Hayden, but they don't tell you they're all saying that the taste sucks, or the price sucks, or I love to suck it down out of the bottle. There's no context around that. So what we do is we actually take all that data, we whittle it down to the voice of the consumer. We get rid of all the noise, the press releases and the job postings and the stuff that doesn't matter. We whittle it down to just the voice of the consumer, and then we analyze it and contextualize it and say, hey, the main thing that people talk about when they talk about Basil Hayden is how good it goes with steak. And so you need to start pushing this thing in steakhouses or whatever. So I'm making all that up right now. But that's what we look for, is we look for the context and the actual conversations and how they can help you understand your customer better.
So you mentioned socialmention.com, just kind of speaking to the small business consumer for a second, or owner. So let's just say for a second that they're so small, or that they're just starting out in social media, that there's nothing really being said about their brand. If they do a search on Social Mention, it's kind of crickets. Is there data that they can pull from the industry that would be helpful to them, or what should they do?
So just using socialmention.com, I'll start there. Let's say I am a small business, and let's say I am I make clothing for kids, just randomly. I can go to socialmention.com and type in keyword phrases like, kids t-shirts, kids clothes, kids clothing, kids shoes, whatever. And it'll pull back information where people are talking about those topics. So if I do that in a sophisticated enough way, I can, kind of whittle down to the conversations where parents are talking about, man, I really love shopping for clothes for my kids, but I can't find bib overalls anymore. Nobody makes them these days. Where's my Oshkosh Bagosh? So if you see something like that, now all of a sudden you've got an insight. Hey, if I make overalls, there's a potential market out there for that. Right. So you've got to stop thinking about you and start thinking about the bigger conversation that can help you understand your customer better. Because remember, if you're a new brand, or even if you're a brand in and of itself, people may not necessarily talk about you, but they definitely talk about what you sell. Perfect example, we did an industry report in February for the senior living space. So assisted living, independent living, nursing homes, long-term care facilities. And we found just under 2,000 conversations after we whittled it all down to the voice of the consumer. We found about 2,000 conversations. People saying, I need to select a facility for my parent, my grandparent. I'm going through this process. In almost 2,000 conversations, 2 mentioned a brand name.
Interesting.
2. Interesting. One was Brookdale and one was Atria. The rest of them were, those are big ones. Yeah. But the rest of them were just mentioning nursing home, assisted living, independent living. There's no brand name affinity or association in that particular segment. So understand that people go online and talk about things, but they don't necessarily talk about your brand. You got to look broader than that.
That's a great point. They use keywords, and oftentimes the keywords are not your brand names.
This is true.
Great points. And then one other quick question for you before we move to our last segment. I was thinking Facebook search at this point can also act as almost a social mention, specifically under that native space in Facebook. Is that fair to say for people to be able to do some social listening?
Yeah, you can go in and type in a keyword phrase or a brand name or something in Facebook search. Facebook search is not altogether all that sophisticated, but it's gotten a lot better over the past couple of years, and it will help you. And I'm glad you actually brought that up, because these social listening platforms that'll go out there and find these conversations for you, they do search the publicly available social media websites. Individual Facebook feeds are not publicly available. Facebook actually protects individual user privacy very, very well. So if I go post something about Basil Hayden on my Facebook stream right now, those social listening platforms aren't going to see it. However, if I go to a bourbon lovers group on Facebook that's publicly available, that will pick up. It will see it there. If you go to a brand page, which are generally public and open, it'll show up there. So, and we've done some testing at CRI to determine the publicly available portion of Facebook that shows up is in general between 10 and 15%.
Wow.
The majority of Facebook is not going to show up in these tools. And we've actually done some correlations with several different searches. using a product that you won't be able to access much longer. Facebook topic data, which is something you got to have a sophisticated tool to go find. But we've done some correlation studies, and we've determined that Facebook conversations, people talking about a given topic on Facebook, make up about 60 to 65% of all conversations on the internet.
Yeah.
And you can't get to them from a research or a brand perspective. So you're always going to have to deal with the fact that, well, there's everything and Facebook.
Right.
So until Facebook lets people get at it, you're not going to be able to see it.
What if somebody in a personal Facebook page uses a hashtag? Is still behind the scenes?
If it's on their personal stream, it's not going to come up. The only way you can get to that information is through Facebook topic data, which they are sunsetting in September.
Okay.
And then I'm told there will probably be some mechanism to get high-level aggregate data in the new version of Facebook Ad Manager that will come out so that you can access a little bit more conversation data for targeting. So you could be able to go in and say, I want to target my social post to anybody who used hashtag bourbon. And that will be a way that will manifest itself for brands. But you're not going to be able to do what we do, which is get in and understand the context of the conversation.
And then, that kind of brings to the point of, also, I remember in one of my speaking engagements, an attendee said, Corey, why would I want a Facebook platform for my business? It just gives people a reason to talk about me. And I said, that's the exact reason, right? To have that, right? That environment. Yeah. That's like the perfect tee up topic. But there's also a reminder to our listeners out there to encourage that conversation specifically on your branded company pages, because not only is that you are in control of that, which is a good thing, but you also have the opportunity to monitor and respond.
Yeah. Well, I mean, anybody who says, why would I have Facebook? That gives people an opportunity to talk about my brand. I would say, well, why do you advertise? Because they're going to talk about you there. Why do you put a listing in the phone book? They're going to talk about you there.
Mm-hmm.
It's the problem is that business owners who have that attitude don't realize that 25 years ago, there were millions of water coolers all around the country, and every day people went to them and talked in person. Now there's one big freaking water cooler, and those conversations can be monitored, and you can find out what people are saying. So the people who you are afraid are talking crap about you have been talking crap about you all along. If you are a crappy company. The brands that get it are the ones that understand that by not only allowing the conversation, but participating in it, it puts you in a much better position to build trust and build relationships with those people, even the ones who don't like you at first. The fact that you're just there participating, more often than not, they go, oh, hey, I didn't realize you were paying attention. Well, maybe you can help me with this.
I used to say that Comcast went from really frustrating to kind of annoying, and that's a good thing. And that's just by being able to be there and respond. You're always going to have a frustrating experience with your internet connectivity, which we have thunderstorms going on right now, but so far so good. But that's just kind of part of it, right? But the fact that you're there and that you're being authentic, you admit you make mistakes. I use Bluehost as a hosting that, and they're like, sorry, and they write this whole thing on their Facebook page. It makes me feel better, Jason, that they said sorry to me and the other millions of people that were out.
What those business owners need to understand is 99% of the time, all that disgruntled person wants is acknowledgement.
Yep.
They don't necessarily need you to fix the problem. They don't necessarily need you to say you're sorry in all, contexts. Sometimes they just need to know you heard them and you're like, hey, we hear you. We're having a crappy day. We're working on it. And sometimes that's enough.
What I love about social media is that it simply brings fundamentals that have been around for ever and brings them into a different light. Empathy is what we're talking about here. A little bit of empathy goes a heck of a long way in customer service, and that's been going on since business has been around. So
that's going to be the name of my niche bourbon brand. Is going to be empathy.
Ooh, I like it.
It's going to be the name of it, and I'm going to walk around doing here. You need a little bit more empathy in your life, son. There you go.
That's right. Solves all problems right here.
There you go.
So as we kind of go down the home stretch here, tell me a little bit about your bourbon story, man. Like, I know you live in Kentucky. You're actually in Louisville.
Mm-hmm.
Did you I don't say grow up drinking bourbon, but is it like a pastime for you? Like,
yeah, man, I was off the teat. Here we go. No, I actually was a little bit compared to most Kentuckians. I was a little bit of a latecomer to bourbon. My mom and dad were divorced. My dad, moved away when I was really, really young, and I spent much of the first 20 years of my life trying to kind of reconnect with him. Not that he was lost, estranged or anything, but he lived in Pittsburgh, which is why I'm a big Pirates fan and yay pins and all that good stuff. But I drank mostly beer until I was 6. No, I drank mostly beer until college, maybe grad school, and then I started experimenting with spirits, and I really liked rum and Coke. I would drink Captain Morgan and Coke, and that's kind of where I started as a spirits drinker. And then I discovered through the course of time that rum and me don't get along real well. And the sugar cane part of it, the blood sugar thing happens, and I become something that I don't want to become. So about the same time, I really got the opportunity to go spend a little bit of time on the family farm in Virginia with my dad, and discovered that he was a bourbon drinker and he drank Elijah Craig. And so he poured me an Elijah Craig that I was 22, I think, at the time. And that one summer on the farm, and I've been drinking bourbon ever since, and almost exclusively bourbon as a spirit. I do drink other whiskeys and try them and whatnot, but when I'm drinking because I want to have a couple and burn off a little bit of the day, I have bourbon. And of course, living in Kentucky makes it pretty easy to do. But I typically will. I'm a gulper, not a sipper. So I typically will mix my bourbon with diet soda, which makes the traditional bourbon aficionados sick to their stomach, and they yell and cuss at me. And I had a bartender in Denver, Colorado one time refuse to serve it that way, and I was like, "Look, dude, don't make me jump across this bar. This is how I drink it. Come on." Yeah. I did relinquish. I said, "Okay, give me your rail and diet. I won't put the good stuff in it, even though I put the good stuff in it."
Right.
But I do enjoy tasting bourbons, and I certainly taste those neater with a Cuba Ice to kind of open up the flavor a little bit. But if you see me at a bar having a cocktail before or after dinner, it's probably going to be in a tall glass with diet soda.
Well, and it's a fair point that one thing that those of us who are on the bourbon journey tend to realize, and potentially without knowing it, is that bourbon is anywhere from the low end of 80 proof all the way up to 105, 110 proof. And yeah, if you are gosh, we have a good conversation. And, I had a guy on my show here, Jason, that his bottle was, I was honestly bet down to here by the end of the show, and it got downright silly.
Yeah.
You can't mess around with this stuff. It's pretty potent.
No, it is pretty potent. And something that I would also, too, being in Kentucky and knowing a lot of bourbon drinkers, I will also say this to anybody, especially who's new to it, and especially with somebody like me who mixes it and gets made fun of for it. Everybody has their own palate. Everybody has their own taste. And just because I like Elijah Craig or I like Maker's Mark doesn't mean you're going to, and that's okay. The bourbon industry is special in that you got to remember that Bardstown, Kentucky is really kind of the cradle of bourbon. That's where most of the master distillers are from. That's where a lot of the distilleries are right around there. And if you actually go and look, a lot of the master distillers, they grew up together. They went to school together. Some of them are related. The Beam family has, people in a bunch of different distilleries, not just the Beam distillery. In fact, the Beam family isn't really even in the Beam distillery anymore. It's all the Noes, and
all the No. What does that mean?
Yeah, the No family, Booker No and Freddie. And so that's one of the descendants. Is still a descendant of the Beam family, but the actual surname Beam is actually more of the folks at I think Heaven Hill is where the Beam folks. Craig, I think, is the or was the master distiller. I get the names mixed up. Anyway, but you got to remember, these people went to high school together. Some of them go to church together. Some of them live in the same neighborhoods. So at the production level in Kentucky, there's friendly competition, but these people know each other and they're related to each other and they love each other. And so it's not like you're rooting for one brand and against another. It's, hey, we're making bourbon for the world. And some people are going to like my neighbor's bourbon. Some people are going to like mine. And it's not an end-sum game. There's enough out there for everybody.
That's awesome.
So just understand that when you're talking bourbon with people, if they like something you don't, that's okay. If they like to mix it, that's okay too. It's to each his own. As long as they're drinking bourbon, we're all good.
I remember the reason I started drinking bourbon was I was having a lot of these conversations over wine, very similar. Everything you just said, you could insert wine instead of bourbon.
Yep.
And I was just I wasn't feeling wine, and I wanted something like this to get kind of, passionate about. I don't want to sound like an alcoholic necessarily, but just, when my wife loves wine so much, I wasn't feeling it like that. So I was looking for something else, and bourbon came along. And I'll tell you something, if you meet somebody, I remember a meeting planner out in Vegas, and I happened to say, yeah, I enjoy bourbon. And the next thing you know, we spent, an hour and a half talking bourbon. And that was what I was looking for. It's a great topic of discussion that people get very, very passionate about.
Yeah. I'll share one more thing with you.
Please.
I think people appreciate this. This is funny. So there was a wily old coot at Doe Anderson by the name of Ray Radford. He's still there. And Ray's just a brilliant marketing mind and also a brilliant whiskey guy. He really appreciates good bourbon.
Got to have him on the show then.
Yeah, he would be good. He can tell some stories. And Ray once told me, he said, when you walk into a bar, here's how you know, within the context of a couple of different brands, here's how you know who people are. You walk into a bar and you see a bunch of young guys doing shots at the bar. They're probably drinking Jack Daniels. Right next to them, you see slightly older, maybe graduate students just out of college, and they're drinking cocktail. They're mixing their bourbon. They're probably drinking Jim Beam. If you look over here to the side at the tables, you've got couples sitting over here, husbands and wives having a good time, people in their 30s, maybe in their 40s. They're probably drinking Maker's Mark. And then the two guys at the back of the bar who look like they kill you if you talk to them, they're drinking Knob Creek.
That's awesome. How many years will that be for us, man?
Yeah, I was going to say, that's me tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. All right, a couple rapid fire things, and then I'll let you go, man. It's we're getting close to 10 o'clock witching hour here, and I appreciate all the time and wisdom you've shared with us, Jason. So a couple rapid fire things. I mentioned to you, I wanted to kind of put you on the spot for a second. You wrote a book 5 years ago on email marketing. Mm-hmm. And I was literally having a conversation today about email marketing and really just the challenges with it. All the spam filters, all the, the crowded noise that is email. A, is it dead? B, if it's not dead, from a small business perspective, from just a general business perspective, getting your emails in people's inboxes and open, some best practices there. What are your thoughts?
There's two primary things you need to do if you want to have good email marketing. And email is not dead. It's still one of the more effective digital marketing channels out there. But very few people do it right. There's two things you need to do. Number one, you need to only send emails to people who raise their hand and say they want to get them. So that means you need to say, hey, we've got an email list, and here's all the good stuff that you're going to get if you subscribe to it. And you've got to make that offer insatiable for them to want to say, all right, you can come in my inbox. I will let you send your marketing message to me. So you got to give them a good reason to want to subscribe. And certainly you have to deliver upon that reason. So the first thing is making sure that your list is people who want to get it. Because if you go buy lists, or if you dump customer, purchase emails into, your metrics are going to go down. You're going to piss half the people off. And the other half are going to ignore you.
And just to be clear, if you offer a coupon code and you get an email, does that give you the right to continue to email in that particular philosophy?
Legally, yes. If legally you can add anybody you want to your list as long as you give them the opportunity to opt out of it. And then there's a couple other legal things, like the Can Spam Act says you got to have a return address and all that stuff. But essentially, you can buy lists and you can dump any name into your email list you want to, as long as when you send it, they have the opportunity to opt out.
But in your philosophy, is that?
In my philosophy, no. In my philosophy, only send it to people who say, I want to get your emails.
I want to get your
that way, it's the pure list of people who want to read it. And the second thing you have to do to get people to read your emails is consistently deliver what you promised them. Give them that insatiable content that they can't get anywhere else. Make it worth their while. If you're regurgitating your blog posts via an email newsletter and that's all you're putting in there, nobody's going to read that shit. Yep. Because they can go to your blog whenever they want and read it. Now, there's going to be some people who are like, I don't have the time to go to your blog. Send me an email so I can browse the headlines there. For that group of people, that type of email newsletter works, but that's less than 10% of the people that you're going to send it to. Yep. What you've got to do is say, here's the blog content. Okay, I'm going to do it visually. Here's the blog content or the social media content, right? Here's the email content that we're going to, we need. This is kind of exclusive stuff. We're not going to give it away. You got to come get it via email. And then here's like white papers and webinars and crap that you got to give us your email address, or maybe you even got to pay for. It's going to be really exclusive stuff. So tier that content so that what you're emailing people is good enough for them to say, I got to open this because I can't get it anywhere else.
It's funny. I used to make the example of frequency over values, talk about with email marketing, and it's all about value and less about frequency. And if I remember correctly, you guys were a great example of that with Social Media Explorer. I know you had some sort of email distribution, and I used to say, I was using the example of Mashable, but I'd use you guys in the exact same frame, that I would get an email every single day and I'd never opt out. And why wouldn't I opt out? Every single day. I would say even on Hanukkah, and I'm Jewish, but I'd still get the email, and it didn't matter because the value was so good. However, if I got an email once a quarter and it was not what I was looking for, I'd opt out in half a second. So it's less about frequency, more about value. And I think that's exactly what you're saying.
Well, and there's a perfect example out there too. I don't know if you are, but I happen to be a Dollar Shave Club subscriber and customer, and their email now, like their blog content is fantastic. And it's all for that sort of, hip male, macho lifestyle. It's not like inappropriate macho, but like I can't remember what the headline I saw the other day when I got their email newsletter was, but I had to click on it and open it because it was funny. It was like, 75% of men have more sex when ... And I'm like, I got to read that. Brr, So
yes.
It's the kind of content that you have to stop and take a look at. And they're doing a great job and investing some good dollars in making sure that A, the email list is pure. It's people who want it. And B, the content is so good that you got to open it.
Well, and I tell my team all the time to pay attention to clickbait because you can get some great best practices on titles. And you did a good job on your title, a callback back to that, personal brand over business brand. I mean, you put a little controversy in your title and it made us want to open it, didn't it? You don't do that intentionally.
Yeah, you stir shit up, man.
Yeah.
You got to stir it up. And like, for instance, if I were to write a blog post, a review, let's say I'm writing for a bourbon website and I'm writing a review of Basil Hayden. I'm not just going to say Basil Hayden is the perfect bourbon to go with steak. Whatever. I'm going to say something along the lines of, here's why Basil Hayden will knock your balls off.
Yes.
Or, I'll say something outlandish, but something that I can then tie back into the story and actually deliver on it. But it's going to be something that makes people go, what? I got to click that. And is that clickbait? Sure. But it's not clickbait in a spammy kind of way because I'm going to deliver on that promise when you open the email.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, but by definition, for people, clickbait is, trying to get them to do something and sort of misleading them, but taking the fundamentals of what people do in clickbait, which is just the really enticing, sexy title, and then delivering on that is exactly what we're talking about.
Yep.
Okay. And last question for you before we end the night on our final sip here is, you had mentioned to me about, sponsored content. And one of the things that I know a lot of businesses struggle with right now is Facebook and Instagram being two of the major platforms out there, really changing the game from a business perspective, making you pay to play. What are some best practices around that? What have you seen? What can you help some of the people out there in terms of getting their message to more people? Do they need to pay money? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you don't have a built-in audience, if you haven't been laying that foundation and building an audience of potential customers over the years, you're going to need to do something. Paid social, paid advertising in various channels does help you get exposure. I would probably not pour a whole lot of money into pay-per-click if you're trying to get people to immediately direct response buy something. But for branding and awareness, it's good to put some paid social or some online media spend behind what you're doing to try to make sure that you're building that awareness for what your product is. But in terms of sponsored content, there's plenty of opportunities out there, whether it be working through established influencers who have large followings on these channels, or even in industry niches where you've got someone who maybe they don't have 100,000 followers on Twitter. Maybe they only have 25,000, but they're a respected voice in that vertical. Partnering with them to say, hey, we'd like for you to write a post about this new thing we've got going to help spread awareness. We want you to disclose that it's sponsored, but we want to make it worth your while to do it, so we're going to pay you for it. Having a budget for that and reaching out and working with influencers is a great way to have that sort of third-party validation, that endorsement, and you're co-opting their network.
Right.
So actually, in the marketing, world, I get, a couple of brands will reach out to me from time to time and say, hey, we'd like to work with you on a sponsored post. I actually wrote one today for Microsoft 365, and it'll be coming out in a couple of weeks. And so I've partnered with them, and they're paying me to write the post. But I went to them and said, I'll do this, but it has to serve my audience, and it has to be my perspective. I'm not just going to be a mouthpiece for what you want to say. I'm going to look at what you want to talk about, and I'm going to give them my own perspective on it. That's the only way I'll do it from an ethical standpoint. But that's exactly what Microsoft wanted. They were like, that's what we want. That's
why they reached out to you.
Right. We know that you do it that way. So that's why we're reaching out to you. Yeah. So finding those influencers within your niche that can help reach that audience and do it in an authentic way that the audience believes and understands, but also accepts the fact that, well, they're being paid for this, but they're not going to lie to me. Those are the kind of influencers you want to try to identify, and doing sponsored content on those platforms and in those contexts, I think, is pretty effective.
And you made a very crystal clear point that I just want to reiterate to folks that there's, Jason mentioned the beginning in 2006, kind of the old way, or the kind of cheating way of doing it. And then the cheating way of doing it is to promote a product and be paid for it and not disclose it. And the authentic, above board way of doing it is to disclose that, hey, I've been asked to do this. I'm more than happy to do it because I am a fan, but I'm going to disclose it, is the right way and the authentic way of doing it. And, kudos to you for suggesting that, because I think it's a phenomenal way for people to get their message across to larger audiences. Well, folks, as much as I hate to say it, because damn, time flies when you're having fun, I could keep you on literally for a couple more hours and we'd be freaking smashed. But I'd love to have you back on again. And we'll talk about maybe, a different bourbon. But not only is your expertise in social and in digital and in social listening phenomenal, but I didn't know that your bourbon expertise was as impressive as it is. I literally last week, Jason, had a bourbon sommelier, if you will, from a restaurant called Table and Main, and I mean, he phenomenal. Yep. But you right up there, man. And I didn't even know that about you. So really, really cool. Thank you again for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
It just means I've spent a lot of time in bars.
Yeah, exactly. Which, hey, this gives us, the guy today at the liquor store, I was pulling out my credit card and he was like, I know you were telling me about this podcast, don't you? And I was like, yeah, why not? And I gave him the business credit card. So maybe at minimum I can be writing off.
Write it off, man. Write it off.
Well, again, last question, Jason. For people to be able to connect and follow you and stay in touch with you, what's the best way of doing it?
I'm Jason Falls everywhere. There's a politician in North Carolina who hates me because he can't win a Google search to save his life. But that's fine. He's Republican and I'm not, so 999, whatever. No, I'm Jason Falls on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. Those are my three primary networks. JasonFalls.com is where you can find my blog and whatnot. And you'll see me, writing about bourbon and other things at a couple of various places. So Google's your friend. Just Google my name. You'll find me.
I'll tell you something, folks. If you're looking for, one of the social media digital marketing experts that the digital marketing experts follow, this is one of the guys. So
it's because I bought him drinks all these years.
Do it. And I really appreciate, again, the time, my friend. This is Business Over Bourbon, episode 6, I think. Super excited about the future. Yes, sir, man. And hey, we'll take sponsorships. Basil Hayden, come on now. Come on. I can be bought in bourbon, and so can Jason. So,
yep.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Cheers.